The wall clock struck midnight. In the sprawling penthouse where footsteps echoed like whispers in a cathedral, Grace Torres sat alone on the edge of the bed, her eyes wide open in the darkness. Her heart beat slowly, steadily, but in the thick silence it sounded like a dull knock at the door, a reminder that she was still alive, though trapped in a marriage that had been dying for a long time. Beside her the pillow was cold, the sheets smooth as if untouched. Like hundreds of nights before, Jonathan Smith, her billionaire husband, the man who once set her world ablaze, was absent tonight. He claimed urgent business at the company, a late-night video call with Asian partners, or a contract needing last-minute revisions. But Grace knew that sometimes he sat in his office downstairs, the desk lamp burning through the night, like a fortress keeping them apart. 2 years of marriage, 730 days. She could count on her fingers the number of times he'd been by her side when darkness fell. It wasn't just physical absence, the intimacy, the whispered words by the pillow, the warm embrace that lulled one to sleep. Grace no longer had all of that. She tightened the silk nightgown around her and walked to the massive glass window. Below, Los Angeles glittered with lights, its streets alive with ceaseless traffic. The city pulsed with life, vibrant and restless, while her heart lay still, aching in its quiet. "What's all this for?" she whispered, her gaze drifting over the expensive paintings on the walls, the exquisite sculptures in the living room, or the bed twice the size of the apartment she once shared with her mother. Grace remembered the early days when Jonathan wasn't yet a living block of ice. He'd been the man who could make her laugh with a single glance. He'd held her hand in movie theaters, called her in the middle of meetings to say, "I miss you." Back then, Grace believed she was the luckiest woman alive. Now she was merely a shadow in this opulent house. The faint sound of the door opening broke the silence. Jonathan stepped in, his gray suit impeccable, his tie loosened halfway. The clock showed just past midnight, but he looked exhausted, as if he'd endured an endless day. His dark brown hair was neatly combed, his green eyes glinting with fatigue. He carried the air of a successful, powerful man, but to Grace, he was a stranger who'd wandered into her room. "You're still awake?" Jonathan asked, his voice low and soft, more out of polite habit than genuine concern. Grace turned to face him. "This is my bedroom too, Jonathan. I can stay up or sleep whenever I want." He paused briefly, swiftly removed his tie and draped his jacket over a chair. His movements were precise, mechanical, as if she didn't exist in this space. "I know," he replied curtly. "Do you?" "Sometimes I feel more like a decorative piece you bought for your collection than a wife." Grace's voice trembled, but held firm. Jonathan looked up. For a fleeting moment, Grace caught a strange glint in his eyes, perhaps pain or guilt. But it vanished, replaced by the familiar wall of coldness. "I'm tired, Grace. Let's not start this tonight." Grace stepped toward him, her words cracking like fractures in glass. "If not tonight, then when? Next week, next month, or when this marriage is nothing but ashes?" He sat down in a chair by the window, cradling his head. The streetlights cast shadows on his face, highlighting the dark circles and weary lines. "It's complicated," he said. Grace let out a bitter laugh. "No marriage is simple. 2 people share love and live together. You're the one making it complicated, Jonathan." The air between them thickened like an invisible but unbreakable glass wall. Grace waited, hoping for an explanation, even a sliver of truth, but he remained silent, his lips pressed tightly together. Just as she thought he might speak, Jonathan stood abruptly. "I have an early meeting. We'll talk later." "Later." When Grace called after him, but the door had already closed. The room sank back into silence. Grace stood motionless, feeling like the world had turned its back on her. She'd been patient for 2 years, believing love could bridge the distance. But the longer she waited, the more she felt herself fading from his life. She returned to the bed, lying down and staring at the towering ceiling. Tears soaked her pillow. She'd once dreamed of a home filled with laughter and clasped hands. Now all she had was a cold house and a husband who was a master at avoidance. In her fitful dreams, Grace recalled the proposal. Jonathan had knelt on the Malibu shore, the red sunset blazing behind him. "I want you to be the last person I see every night, and the first I know every morning." Those words now felt like a cruel joke. The next morning, golden sunlight flooded the lavish kitchen. Grace brewed coffee, its aroma filling the air, but her heart remained cold. Jonathan sat across from her, his eyes glued to his phone, fingers swiping endlessly. "Have you ever thought about us?" Grace asked softly. Jonathan looked up momentarily, caught off guard. "What do you mean? When will you look into my eyes and remember you have a wife?" This time he stopped. His green eyes met hers, startled and uneasy. Grace continued. "I called Diana Martinez, the divorce lawyer. You remember her, don't you? The one who helped Sarah escape her miserable marriage." Jonathan set his fork down, his eyes widening. "What? What are you saying? I don't want a divorce, Jonathan. I want a marriage. But if we're living just emptiness, then divorce is the answer." At that moment, Jonathan wasn't a confident billionaire. He sat, frozen fear etched across his face. But once again he said nothing. No explanation, no plea to stay. Grace turned away, gazing at the lush hanging garden beyond the glass. "I can't keep living like this. I need to be loved and have a real husband, not a shadow in a suit who comes and goes like a guest." Jonathan opened his mouth but closed it again. He only whispered, "We'll talk later." Grace nodded, no longer crying. A decision had taken root in her heart. She would no longer wait in vain. She would reclaim herself, even if it meant walking away from this marriage. That morning, sunlight spilled across the marble floor, casting cold, shimmering rays throughout the vast kitchen. Grace sat motionless before her cooled coffee, twirling a silver spoon like a sleepwalker. Last night, after the tense conversation with Jonathan, she had barely slept. Each evasive response, each silent shake of his head, felt like a knife carving away the last of her faith. Her phone lit up. A message from Lisa, her sister. "You okay? If it's too much, Chicago always has a place for you, and the kids miss their aunt." Grace gave a faint smile, her lips trembling. Those simple words brought a warmth this place lacked. Jonathan appeared immaculate in his suit, coffee steam rising from the cup in his hand, phone pressed to his ear. He was discussing a $100 million project, his tone cold and decisive. As he passed her, he offered a slight nod, instead of a greeting, then sank back into numbers, contracts and stocks. Grace watched him, a thought piercing her. How often will I sit across from a husband who feels like he doesn't exist? She stood, cleared her coffee cup, and headed toward the staircase to the bedroom. Each step echoed, solidifying a decision taking shape. Grace opened a large suitcase in the quiet bedroom, pulling out drawers individually. Her hands brushed against designer dresses and shoes Jonathan had bought her, but her eyes were empty. All this luxury couldn't mend the void in her heart. She folded clothes layer by layer into the suitcase. Each item packed felt like a step away from a life of pretending to be happy. In a small drawer, she found their wedding photo. Her radiant smile from that day now twisted her heart with pain. The Jonathan in the picture gazed at her with adoration, an expression long gone. A soft knock sounded. Jonathan stepped in, his phone still in hand, but he froze when he saw the suitcase. "What are you doing?" His voice was low, tinged with shock. Grace didn't look up. "I'm going to Chicago for a while. I need a change of air." "Chicago? Why, you can stay here. If you want." I'll have someone arrange a trip to Italy or the Maldives. She cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. I don't need a vacation. I need a husband. Jonathan fell silent, slowly lowering his phone. She saw his lips move as if he wanted to say something, but as always, only heavy silence followed. Grace faced him, her eyes blazing with resolve. Jonathan, I've waited long enough. For 2 years I've lived with a husband who only says later. But later never comes. If you can't tell me the truth, let me go. He took a step forward, his eyes flashing with panic. Grace, please don't make this extreme. I need more time. Time for what? To keep pretending we're happy? Or for me to completely vanish from your life? For the first time, Jonathan didn't look away. His green eyes held something complex, perhaps fear or an unspoken longing, but still no answer. Grace took a deep breath and zipped the suitcase shut. The sharp sound echoed through the room, a final declaration. I'm flying tonight. Lisa's waiting for me. He raised a hand to stop her, but it hung in the air. No words were strong enough to hold her back. He only nodded faintly, his eyes dropping, revealing a man drained of strength. Grace carried the suitcase downstairs. Her footsteps echoed on the marble, heavy, yet liberating. The housekeeper moved to help, but she shook her head. This was something she had to do herself, leaving this seemingly splendid but frigid house. In the living room, Jonathan stood motionless, sunlight glinting off his suit, making him look like a flawless sculpture. But Grace knew that beneath the facade was a heart rotting from fear and silence. She opened the door, and a breeze carried the scent of lavender from the small garden. Part of her wanted to turn back, hoping he'd call her name Rush, to hold her like he used to. But behind her, there was only silence. Grace stepped out the door, closing behind her. She breathed the air of freedom for the first time in 2 years. It hurt, but it was real. That afternoon at the airport, she sat in the waiting area, her suitcase by her side. She watched couples chatting happily, families lugging bags, and wondered, will I ever have that again? Her phone buzzed. Jonathan was calling. Grace stared at the screen for a long moment, then pressed decline. She was done with empty promises. Instead, she typed a message. Jonathan, I'm not abandoning you, but I'm abandoning this way of living. When you're ready to really talk, I'll listen. For now, I need to leave. She hit send, then took a deep breath. It felt like a tight cord around her chest had finally been cut. The airport loudspeaker announced the boarding call for the Chicago flight. Grace stood gripping the suitcase handle. She didn't know what the future held, divorce, reconciliation, or an entirely new path. But at least she had dared to take a step. Los Angeles shrank beneath her as the window shade closed on the plane. The skyscrapers receded, their golden lights fading into specks. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, Goodbye, Jonathan. If you want to keep me, prove it with actions. If not, I'll learn to live a different life, one with genuine warmth. In Grace's heart, a quiet pain still burned, but it mingled with a spark of hope. Hope that by leaving, he might realize something more valuable than money or power. Love cannot be postponed indefinitely. The plane soared into the clouds. Her heart raced, not from fear, but because she felt in control of her life, for the first time in ages. Jonathan's office was a place Grace rarely entered. It was vast, like a private library, with a high ceiling and golden lamplight, casting a warm glow on the polished walnut desk. Bookshelves lined with files and economics books flanked the room. Standing before the heavy door, Grace often felt barred by an invisible wall. But that afternoon, as she prepared to leave, a powerful urge made her grasp the handle and push it open. The air inside was thick with the scent of fresh wood, mingled with a faint trace of whiskey. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the black leather chair where Jonathan spent hours. Grace strolled, her heels clicking softly on the floor. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat beside a stack of papers on the desk. Her gaze fell on a small wooden box tucked in the corner of the desk. Unlike the room's ornate decor, it was a simple oak box, its surface smooth, secured by an old metal clasp. At first glance, it seemed like a worthless personal item, but something in Grace whispered that it held something significant. Her heart pounded as her hand touched the lid. Part of her protested, insisting she shouldn't invade her husband's privacy, but another part urged her, without the truth, she'd never understand why their marriage had crumbled. The clasp wasn't locked tightly. A gentle twist opened it. Grace lifted the lid. Inside were neatly arranged white envelopes, each bearing her name in Jonathan's familiar handwriting. The slanted, slightly trembling script was unlike the confident strokes of his public signatures. Her hand shook as she pulled out one envelope, dated a few months after their wedding. Grace, tonight, I sat watching you sleep. You breathed so steadily, so peacefully, like an angel. I don't understand why you chose me, knowing my flaws. I'm afraid I'll hurt you someday. I love you so much, but it sometimes feels suffocating. And because I love you, I'm terrified I'll ruin everything. Grace covered her mouth. The words cut into her like a knife. For 2 years, she'd thought his coldness meant he no longer cared. But here he confessed a love so immense it had turned into fear. She opened a second letter, dated a year later. I know you're lonely, but whenever I want to hold you, memories of my family flood. I hear my father's rage, my mother's silent tears. Love in my house started sweet, but became a chain. I swore I wouldn't repeat that, but the harder I try to avoid it, the further I drift from you. Forgive me, Grace. Tears fell onto the paper, smudging the blue ink. His silence suddenly had an explanation. Jonathan wasn't indifferent or dismissive. He loved her, but the ghosts of his childhood bound him. She pulled out more letters. Some described his guilt watching her eat dinner alone. Others revealed his torment, longing to be close, but retreating, haunted by images of his violent father. The final letter, written just a week ago, gripped her heart like a vice. I know you're about to leave me. Your eyes say it all. You deserve a better man, more substantial, more normal. But I can't let go. You're the only good thing I have. I selfishly hold on to you even though I'm the one hurting you. Grace sank into the chair, clutching the letters to her chest. She sobbed, no longer holding back. She'd thought him heartless, but he was trapped in a prison of fear, loving her in silence. She stood carefully, placing the envelopes back in the box and closing the lid. Her trembling hand brushed the smooth surface. A storm of emotions swirled within her: pity, anger, heartbreak. He could have shared this with her, but he chose silence. And that silence had shattered their marriage. The door creaked open. Grace turned quickly. Jonathan stood there, his face flashing with panic as he saw the box in her hands. You. Read them. His voice was low, almost choked. Grace gripped the box tightly. Yes. And now I finally understand why you've been so distant. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes wild with fear. You shouldn't have read them. Those were things I never meant for you to know. So you planned to hide from me forever, until we were completely broken. Grace's voice was firm, resolute. Jonathan, I needed the truth, not your silence. He bowed his head, shoulders heavy. For a moment, Grace saw not the cold billionaire the world admired, but a man tormented by his past. She stepped closer, her eyes red. You're afraid you'll be like your father, but you're not him. You've let fear control you instead of love. Jonathan looked up, his eyes filled with pain. I don't know where to start. Whenever I try to speak, I hear the shouting from my childhood. I thought silence would protect you, but it only hurt you. Grace set the box on the desk, taking a deep breath. Now you have to choose. Keep living in the past, or face it to hold on to the present. In the room bathed in afternoon light, they faced each other. On one side was a legacy of fear. On the other, a resolve refused to yield. In that silence, Grace felt for the first time in ages that they were truly seeing each other, no longer hiding. Her heart whispered, "Maybe this is the real beginning of the conversation we should have had long ago." The flight to Chicago landed on a chilly afternoon, the wind tousling Grace's hair as she stepped out. At the domestic terminal, Lisa stood waiting, her wide smile and open arms enveloping Grace in a warmth that melted her heart. The embrace unleashed the pent-up tension of recent days, and hot tears streamed down her face. "You're here now. You don't have to hold it together anymore," Lisa whispered, squeezing her sister's shoulders. Two children ran up, clinging to Grace's legs. "Auntie Grace, are you really staying with us?" Emma squealed, while Jake just grinned, his eyes sparkling. Their joy brought Grace back to a childhood in which family bonds weren't scarred by silence or cold walls. Lisa's small house sat in a quiet neighborhood, a stark contrast to the opulence Grace had left behind. That evening's dinner was simple, fragrant lasagna and crisp garlic bread, but its warmth nearly brought Grace to tears as she sat with the family around a round wooden table, surrounded by the children's lively laughter. The first night, Grace struggled to sleep. The cozy guest room had a floral quilt and a window facing a tree-lined yard, but her mind churned with the image of Jonathan, head bowed in his office. He hadn't tried to stop her from leaving, but those eyes held too much fear and helplessness. On the second day, Lisa dragged her out for a walk around the neighborhood. Small coffee shops, flower stores, and corner markets offered a rhythm of life, unlike the one Grace knew. No supercars, no bowing housekeepers, no towering glass walls. She felt grounded, walking on real earth instead of floating in a cold, lavish world. "What's your plan?" Lisa asked as they sat in a cozy cafe sipping hot lattes. Grace shook her head. "I want some peace for now. I'll stay the whole 2 weeks. If Jonathan doesn't change after that, I'll figure out what's next." Lisa took her hand, her gaze steady. "Just remember your worth. Don't let someone else's fear make you a prisoner." Grace nodded, her sister's words echoing in her heart. While playing puzzles with Emma and Jake on the 5th day, her phone buzzed. Jonathan's name lit up the screen. Her hand trembled, but she answered. His voice was hoarse, weary. "Grace, I'm not okay. The house feels so empty. You said 2 weeks, but I just needed to hear your voice." Grace closed her eyes, breathing deeply. "I'm still here. But Jonathan, I can't come back if you're not ready to change." There was a pause, then a soft reply. "I want to try. I don't know where to start." "Then start with the truth." She said, no more hiding. The call was brief, but it planted a seed of hope in Grace. For the first time in months, Jonathan had admitted his vulnerability. Over the next few days, they spoke every evening. Some calls lasted minutes, others hours. Jonathan began opening up about his past tense childhood evenings, the sound of breaking objects, the cracks in his family. He confessed to spending his life running from those memories, unintentionally making Grace a victim of his escape. She listened without interrupting. Each story pierced her heart, but unlocked a door he'd kept bolted shut. On the 8th day, Grace sat in the kitchen with Lisa after a call ended. "He's starting to talk, but I don't know if I can trust it." Lisa poured more tea. "Trust is your choice. At least he's taken a first step. The question is, do you have the patience for the ones that follow?" Grace gazed out the window where snow began to fall lightly. She stayed silent, her heart wrestling with itself. On the 10th day, Jonathan called later than usual, his voice trembling. "I saw a therapist today. It was my first session. I've never done this before." Grace's throat tightened. She knew he'd just broken down a central wall. "You did the right thing. Keep going, Jonathan. I want you to heal for yourself, not just for me." On the 12th day, walking in the park with the kids, Grace realized she was laughing more. For the first time in ages, her heart felt lighter. Perhaps this distance wasn't just giving Jonathan time to reflect. It was helping her see what she needed and wanted. On the evening of the 13th day, Jonathan said over the phone, "I'm still scared, Grace. But every time I close my eyes, I think of losing you. And that fear is bigger than anything else. I don't want to live without you." She was silent for a long moment before replying softly, "I don't want to live without you either. But we can't go back to how things were. If you want to keep me, we must learn to start over." On the 14th day, early in the morning, Grace sat on Lisa's porch, cradling a mug of hot tea, watching the sunrise paint the Chicago sky pink. A message from Jonathan arrived. "I've ordered flowers for when you return. This time, I won't make you wait." Grace closed her eyes, a faint smile spreading across her lips. The 2 weeks apart had bruised her heart, but they'd also kindled hope that from here their love could begin to heal. That afternoon, Los Angeles bathed in soft golden sunlight. The sky was clear with cotton-like clouds drifting lazily, but a storm churned within Jonathan's heart. He sat in his car parked outside a low-rise building, surrounded by green trees, a small sign hanging by the door. "Counseling Office. Dr. Harper." His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Never had his heart pounded so fiercely. For Jonathan, signing billion-dollar contracts or persuading a boardroom was easier than crossing this threshold. But Grace's words echoed in his mind. "If you want to keep me, start with the truth." Those words pushed him to open the car door and step out. The building's hallway was bright, scented with faint lavender. Jonathan felt like a stranger in uncharted territory when the receptionist ushered him in. The counseling room was small with gray upholstered chairs, a round wooden table, and shelves lined with thick psychology books. Dr. Harper, a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, nodded in greeting. "Please have a seat. I understand this is your first session." Jonathan nodded, his throat dry. He sat feeling as though the chair might swallow him whole. "Yes. I don't know how to start. Just say the first thing that comes to mind." After a few seconds of silence, he blurted, "I'm afraid. Afraid of becoming like my father." Each word fell like a shard from a long, cracked wall. Harper listened without interrupting. Jonathan spoke of haunting childhood nights, his father's shouts, shattering dishes, his mother's silent tears. He confessed to carrying those images his whole life, unconsciously building a barrier between himself and the woman he loved most. When he finished, sweat beaded on his forehead. Harper offered a tissue. "You've carried this burden too long. Fear doesn't fade when we avoid it. It grows. But speaking today is already a step forward." Jonathan clutched the tissue. Deep within, he felt a chain begin to break. That evening, he called Grace. His voice trembled, but held firm. "I saw the therapist today. I told her everything I've kept hidden." There was a brief silence on the other end before Grace replied softly, "I'm proud of you. That's the first time you've been courageous." Jonathan's chest warmed. Her acknowledgement meant more than any award or title he'd ever received. In the days that followed, he continued meeting with Harper. Each session peeled away another layer of the cold armor he'd worn for so long. He learned to separate memories from the present, to understand that love didn't equate to violence, and that silence could kill a relationship. At the same time, Jonathan began changing small habits. He stopped staying late at the office. In the evenings, he tried cooking simple meals, albeit clumsy pasta dishes, and sent photos to Grace. He wanted her to see his genuine effort, not just vague promises. One night alone in the living room, soft lamplight bathed the quiet house. On the table sat the wooden box where he'd once hidden his letters. Instead of concealing it, he opened it and wrote a new one, brief but heartfelt. Grace, I've started my journey out of the darkness. I'm not sure I'll quickly become the perfect husband, but I want to be your trustworthy partner. Thank you for not giving up on me. He didn't tuck the letter away this time. He left it on the table ready for Grace to read whenever she returned. On the 11th day since Grace left, Jonathan sent a message. I don't want to make empty promises. You'll see the changes when you come back. But whatever you decide, I'll keep walking this path. Grace replied after a few minutes. I'll be watching. I need to see you act, not just talk. Jonathan smiled. Though brief, her message gave him renewed faith. On the 13th day during a session, Harper asked, What are you prepared to do to keep the woman you love? Jonathan paused, then said, I'll stop running. I'll speak my fears instead of letting them consume us both. Then start with something small. When she returns, don't let silence take over again. He nodded. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt he wasn't entirely powerless. The road ahead held challenges, but he'd taken the first step one of facing his fears instead of fleeing. That evening, he stood on the balcony, gazing at the city's glittering lights, like countless stars at his feet. He told himself, This is the first time I've been fearless, and this time I won't turn back. The Chicago morning glowed with sunlight. Grace sat by the window holding a steaming mug of tea, her eyes tracing the frost-covered branches sparkling like tiny diamonds. Lisa entered, leaning gently against the doorframe. Have you decided? Her sister asked softly, her eyes full of concern. Grace set the mug down, her hands clasped tightly. I'm going back, not because everything's fixed, but because I need to see how far he's changed. Lisa nodded, stepping forward to hug her. Go, but don't forget you always have a home here. That afternoon, Grace headed to the airport. Her heart wasn't as heavy this time as when she left Los Angeles, but it wasn't entirely light either. She knew this flight carried both hope and fear. As the plane landed, the city was draped in sunset's glow. Through the airport's glass, Grace spotted a familiar figure. Jonathan stood there, wearing a simple white shirt instead of his usual polished suit. In his hands was a bouquet of yellow tulips, her favorite flower one he'd never noticed before. Their eyes met. For a moment, Grace almost forgot the distance that had separated them. But she reminded herself, don't soften too soon. Look at his actions, not fleeting gestures. Jonathan approached, offering the flowers. Welcome back. Grace took the bouquet, nodding slightly. They walked to the car in silence, the air between them tense, but different. Not the heavy silence of before, but a space waiting to be filled. On the drive home, Jonathan didn't play music or take calls. He focused on the road, occasionally glancing at Grace to confirm she was there. As the car turned onto the road to the penthouse, Grace noticed new rows of small trees lining the path. She was surprised, recalling how she'd once suggested it, but he'd never listened. Stepping into the house, Grace froze. The space was transformed. The cold, abstract paintings were gone, replaced by soothing landscapes. The living room carried a faint vanilla scent, and warm golden light had taken over from the stark white. On the dining table, 2 plates paired with wine glasses sat across each other. Jonathan looked at her, his voice low but clear. I made dinner. Nothing fancy. Just simple pasta. I hope you don't laugh. Grace sat down. The pasta wasn't perfect. The noodles were slightly sticky, and the tomato sauce was lumpy. But she saw sincerity in it. She took a bite and smiled faintly. Not bad. First time I've seen you actually cook. Jonathan exhaled, a small smile breaking through. I want to start with the little things. No more promises with just words. After dinner, they sat on the balcony, the city's lights stretching like a sea of stars. Jonathan set his wine glass down and turned to face Grace. I know flowers or dinner can't erase the hurt, but I want you to see I'm ready to change. I've met with the therapist several times. Each session I realized my silence was as harmful as the shouting I grew up with. Grace listened intently. His voice trembled, but it carried resolve. This wasn't the closed-off Jonathan she once knew. What I need, Grace said slowly, isn't a perfect version of you. I need a husband who shares. If you're scared, say it. If you want to cry, cry. Please don't make me keep guessing. Jonathan nodded firmly, as if committing her words to memory. I'll try. And if I lose my way, remind me. Don't leave again. In that moment, Grace saw his eyes shine with faith instead of fear for the first time in ages. In the days that followed, they tried living differently. Jonathan left the office earlier, joining Grace for evening walks. They talked about small things, a movie they watched, street food, even the weather. These seemingly trivial moments became the foundation for a relationship that had once been fractured. One weekend evening, as Grace read in the living room, Jonathan emerged from his office holding a stack of papers. He sat beside her. Please read this. Grace opened it, finding handwritten notes. His fears, the memories that haunted him, and a list of things he wanted to do to change. One bold line stood out. Learn to say, I love you, without feeling guilty. Tears welled in Grace's eyes. She squeezed his hand. Jonathan, this is what I've been waiting for. Not perfection, but truth. He smiled, a bit awkward. I love you, Grace. The words were simple, but they rang like a new vow. That night, as they lay together, words weren't needed. The warmth of their silent embrace was enough for Grace to believe this return wasn't in vain. In her heart, hope began to grow. The journey ahead might still hold challenges, but at least now they were taking their first steps together. The first morning of the week, sunlight filtered through thin curtains, illuminating the apartment. Grace woke with an unfamiliar feeling. The bed was no longer empty. Jonathan lay beside her, his breathing steady, his face relaxed in a rare moment of peace. She lay still, listening, her heart warmed yet restless. Change had begun, but would it hold? They shared breakfast in a light atmosphere. Jonathan brewed coffee while Grace prepared toast. They exchanged small talk, soft laughter filling the air. But when Jonathan left for work, a knot tightened in Grace's chest. Was this peace just fleeting? That afternoon, Jonathan returned later than expected, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion from tense meetings. Grace set the prepared dinner on the table and waited. He sat, forcing a smile, but after a few polite words, silence settled in. Grace studied him. Are you slipping back into work to escape? She asked gently but pointedly. Jonathan looked up, startled. No, it's just been a rough day. Grace set down her cutlery and moved closer. I don't want bad days to excuse you from disappearing again. Tell me what happened. He hesitated, then sighed. A significant project hit a snag. The board is pressuring me and I'm scared I'll fail. Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she took his hand. I can't help you crunch numbers, but I can be here so you don't carry it alone. In that moment, Jonathan rested his head on her shoulder for the first time in years, letting vulnerability show. Grace wrapped her arms around him, feeling his tense heartbeat slow. The next day, a different challenge arose. Grace ran into Daniel, an old colleague from her design firm, who invited her for coffee to catch up. She agreed, craving a light conversation after months of marital strain. Daniel was as witty as ever. They laughed, reminiscing about old projects and long nights at the drafting table. When Grace returned home, Jonathan was in the living room glancing at his watch, then at her, his eyes betraying unease. "Where were you so late?" he asked, his voice restrained. Grace told him honestly. Jonathan fell silent, his face tightening. She stepped forward, meeting his gaze. "What are you thinking? That I betrayed you? That I'm finding joy with someone else?" Jonathan lowered his head, hands clenched. "I'm just scared of losing you. Scared one day you'll find someone easier to be with." Grace sighed, sitting beside him. "I'm here not because someone's better or worse, but because I believe we can still save this. But that belief needs you to nurture it, not just me." He looked at her eyes, torn. "I know, and I'll keep proving it to you." In the days that followed, Jonathan made genuine efforts. He cut back on late meetings, spending evenings at home. Once he even suggested a walk by the beach, something he'd always dismissed as too busy before. But change was never a straight path. One evening, Jonathan came home with a heavy expression, tossed his briefcase onto a chair, and shut himself in his office with a slammed door. Grace stood in the kitchen, her heart aching. After hesitating, she knocked. "Can you share what's wrong? Or are you falling back into old habits?" The door cracked open. Jonathan stood there, eyes red. "I just fought with my father on the phone. He demanded money or he'd smear the family in the press." Grace went quiet. She knew his relationship with his father was never healthy, but seeing him tremble, she sensed the ghosts of his past rising again. "What did you do?" she asked. "I refused, but now I feel guilty, like I'm a bad son." Grace took his hand. "The guilt isn't yours. You don't owe anyone your life to save someone who won't change. You need to protect yourself and this little family." Jonathan stayed silent, then suddenly pulled her into a tight embrace. It wasn't a show of strength, but a plea for help. Grace returned it with steady gentleness. Challenges kept coming. Some days Grace faced her own doubts. When Jonathan grew busy and quiet, echoes of past loneliness crept in. She wondered, am I naive to believe he'll change? One evening, while folding blankets, Grace found a small notebook under Jonathan's pillow. Inside were scribbled lines I almost hid in the office today, but remembered Grace and returned to the table. "Fear's still there, but I won't let it win. Need to talk more, silence kills us." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. These clumsy words proved that Jonathan was fighting day by day, hour by hour. She closed the notebook, taking a deep breath. A new faith stirred within her. These trials weren't meant to destroy, but to test how strong their love could be. That weekend, they attended a charity gala together. Eyes followed them, whispers circulating about a marriage once on the brink. Jonathan held Grace's hand tightly, his gaze proud. On the drive home, he turned to her. "I'm done hiding. If the world knows we're almost broken, let them see we chose to stay together." Grace smiled, feeling the strength in his voice. The days of trials weren't over, but now they were walking together, not as one fleeing and one left behind, but as two facing the storm side by side. The morning air in the penthouse was heavier than usual. Jonathan ended a brief phone call. His face taut, hands clenched until his knuckles whitened. Grace sat at the dining table, quietly observing. She knew something was wrong. His eyes held both anger and helplessness. "Him again?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a chair, his gaze lost in the distance. After a moment, he nodded. "He's in the city, and this time it's not just a call. He wants to meet in person." Grace froze, her heart racing. She'd heard Jonathan's stories of his dark childhood, tied to his father, but this was the first time she faced the possibility of meeting him. "Are you going?" she asked. Jonathan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "I can't keep running. It's time to end this." That afternoon, they drove to a quiet cafe on the outskirts. Jonathan chose a public place to minimize the risk of an explosive confrontation. Grace held his hand, feeling the tremor beneath his calm exterior. The man waiting was much older than the image in Jonathan's memory, but his eyes still carried a cunning, greedy glint. Seeing his son, he smirked. "Finally willing to face your father. No games this time. I need money." Jonathan sat, his voice eerily calm. "You always need money. For years it's been the same." The man shrugged, shameless. "That's grown-up business. You've got more than enough. Why hold back? I raised you, gave you the foundation for your success." Grace couldn't hold back. His success came from his work, not your cruelty or the endless debts you left behind. The man turned to her, sneering. "The new wife, huh? Sharp tongue. Stay out of family matters." Jonathan placed a hand on the table, his voice low. "She is my family, and you no longer control me." The man's smirk faded, his brow furrowing. "You're turning your back on your own father. You'd let me starve on the streets." Jonathan's grip tightened, memories flooding back, nights of his mother's tears, hiding in the closet to escape the sound of breaking glass. He stood locking eyes with his father. "I'm not turning my back. I'm refusing to repeat the cycle. I've tried helping you, but you never change. Today I choose to protect my life. If you want to live decently, stand on your own. Stop dragging me down." The air was suffocating. Grace squeezed Jonathan's hand under the table, lending him strength. The man gritted his teeth, his voice sharp. "You'll regret this," Jonathan replied evenly. "Maybe. But I won't regret letting you ruin the rest of my life." They left the cafe in silence. Outside, the wind blew fiercely, as if trying to sweep everything away. Inside the car, Grace looked at her husband. He was trembling, but his eyes were no longer clouded. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Jonathan leaned back, closing his eyes. "I feel lighter, but it still hurts. No matter how awful he is, he's still my father." Grace placed her hand on his, gentle but firm. "Pain is normal, but you just proved you won't let the past control your future. That's your most significant victory." In the days that followed, Jonathan changed noticeably. He spent more time with their small family, Grace and himself. Work kept him busy, but it no longer served as a shield to hide behind. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, Grace asked softly, "Are you afraid he'll come back?" Jonathan paused, then answered, "Yes, but this time I know I won't waver, because I'm no longer facing it." Grace smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat listening to the whispering wind, feeling a rare peace. Weeks later, Jonathan received an envelope. Inside was a brief letter from his father, written in shaky handwriting. "If you've made your choice, I won't return. Be happy." Jonathan read it silently, then handed it to Grace. She looked at him, seeing a trace of sadness in his eyes, but no fear. "It might be genuine, or it might be temporary," Grace said. "But what matters is you chose your path." Jonathan folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer. "I don't know the future, but I know my present is with you." That night, they cooked a simple meal together. No extravagance, just warmth radiating from the kitchen from their laughter, when Jonathan spilled spices from Grace's trusting gaze. After dinner, they stepped into the garden. Under the golden light, Jonathan took his wife's hand and whispered, "Thank you for standing by me. Without you, I don't know if I'd have had the courage to face him." Grace smiled, her eyes shining. "You did it with your own strength. I just reminded you that you're not alone." Jonathan leaned down, kissing her forehead. At that moment, they both knew that this trial was a milestone marking Jonathan's growth and the deepening of their love. As their third wedding anniversary approached, the house buzzed with a renewed energy. Grace woke early, stepping into the kitchen, to find Jonathan at the wooden table surrounded by crumpled papers, covered in crossed-out lines, as if he'd been struggling to craft something significant. He looked up, smiling sheepishly. "I'm working on some words for the occasion." Grace didn't press further. She understood this wasn't just another anniversary. They'd crossed an abyss and were now holding hands into a new journey. The idea for a small ceremony came when Jonathan suggested, "Let's do it again." An absolute vow, not the rushed words from a lavish ceremony before. This time, the people who matter most importantly, we know exactly what we're promising. Grace paused, then nodded. A warm spark ignited within her. This wasn't an obligation, it was a deliberate choice for both. They held it in the garden behind the apartment where Grace had planted small flower pots to dispel the coldness. Jonathan hired a decorating team, but joined in himself, choosing flowers, hanging lights, even repainting wooden chairs. Grace was surprised to see him unbothered by paint smudged on his sleeves, his face lit with childlike joy. "I want this to be something we create together," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. On the day of the ceremony, sunset bathed the garden in golden light. The guest list was small, close friends: Lisa, with her 2 kids, and a few of Jonathan's trusted colleagues. The setting was simple, not extravagant, but brimming with sincerity. When Grace stepped out in a simple white dress, Jonathan stood under a white floral arch, his eyes shining as they had met the first time. That gaze left Grace breathless. Gone was the distance, replaced by clear trust and love. The officiant smiled, signaling Jonathan to begin. He took a deep breath, holding Grace's hands, his voice steady yet warm. 3 years ago, I said words I didn't fully understand. I thought love was a feeling that would last forever if I just kept up a perfect facade. I was wrong. Love is a choice, a daily decision to stay, despite hardship, despite fear. Today, I promise not to hide anymore. I promise to share, listen, and let you into the shadows I once kept locked away. I promise to choose you every day. His voice caught at the end, but his eyes never wavered. Grace squeezed his hands, her voice rising. When I said yes to marrying you, I thought love needed patience. I tried enduring, waiting, hoping you'd come back to me. But I learned love isn't silent suffering. It's the courage to speak, the trust, to share, the strength to forgive. Today, I promise not to stay quiet. I promise to talk when I need to listen when you're weak, and to build happiness with you. Not just a beautiful facade, but peace in our souls. Tears streaked Grace's cheeks, but her smile glowed. The guests fell silent for a moment, then erupted in applause. Lisa hugged her daughter, whispering, "Your aunt finally got what she deserves." After the ceremony, Grace and Jonathan sat by the still twinkling floral arch as guests left. The night was quiet, filled only with the sound of the breeze and their synced heartbeats. Jonathan held his wife's hand, his voice warm. "I've never felt so free. Not because everything's perfect, but because I know we can face any challenge together." Grace nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "The most precious thing isn't a grand ceremony. You genuinely want to start over with me." He smiled, kissing her hair. "This time, I won't let fear lead. It's just you and our future." In the days that followed, they lived with a new spirit. Jonathan opened up, often seeking Grace's input on big decisions. Grace learned to share her feelings frankly, no longer bottling up sadness. They still argued at times, but instead of turning away, they chose to sit down and find solutions. While sorting old photos one evening, Grace found their wedding picture from 3 years ago. She smiled brightly in it, but her eyes held worry. Jonathan stood beside her, his face cold. She showed it to him. "Look how different we were." Jonathan studied it, then smiled. "Yes. Back then, I stood beside you, but wasn't really with you. Now." He leaned over, kissing her lips. "I'm here honestly." Grace laughed through tears. News of their small ceremony leaked, and tabloids spun it as the strange reconciliation of a wealthy couple. Jonathan no longer bristled. He held Grace's hand and said, "They can write what they want. We know our real story, and that's what matters." Grace agreed. They'd rebuilt the most significant trust in each other, not the world's opinion. One late evening, as they sat in the living room with candles flickering from a romantic night, Jonathan asked softly, "Are you ever scared that we might stumble again?" Grace squeezed his hand, smiling. "Yes, but I'm not afraid of failing. I'm so scared of not trying. And now I know, as long as we keep choosing each other, every hardship is just a test." Jonathan looked into her eyes. "Then let's make a new vow. No running, no hiding, no giving up." Grace nodded a new vow. They both laughed, their smiles carrying the strength of those who'd touched the depths of pain, and climbed out together. Outside, the breeze carried the scent of flowers into the room. A true beginning was unfolding. After the heartfelt anniversary ceremony, the days flowed with a gentle but distinct rhythm. The apartment was no longer a place of heavy silence, but filled with laughter, conversations, and occasional honest disagreements. Grace realized that love didn't bloom in perfect moments, but grew through the ordinary collisions of life. One morning, Jonathan surprised her by entering the kitchen while she prepared breakfast. He carried a small wooden box, placing it on the table with hesitation. "I have something for you," he said. Grace opened it, revealing a pristine leather-bound notebook, its cover a warm brown. On the first page, Jonathan had written, "Our new journey. Write it all, joys and fears. Hold nothing back." Grace touched the words, her eyes shimmering. "I'll write with you." Weeks later, Jonathan took a few days off to travel with Grace. They chose a quiet coastal town where no one knew them, free from work pressures or prying eyes. Mornings were spent strolling along the sandy shore, listening to the waves. Evenings found them at small roadside eateries, savoring seafood and discussing the future. "What do you think about having kids?" Grace asked, her voice soft yet cautious. Jonathan gazed at the sea for a long moment before turning to her, his eyes resolute. "I'm ready. Not because it's expected, but because I want to share life's most incredible journey with you." Grace smiled faintly, her heart swelling with joy and a hint of nerves. She knew this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment answer, but a genuine commitment. Back in the city, they dove into reshaping their lives for a new future. Jonathan balanced work, delegating more to his team. Grace enrolled in a short art and event planning course, a dream she'd shelved amid past marital strain. Evenings were spent transforming a spare room into a cozy space. Grace hung her paintings on the walls. Jonathan picked out charming furniture. Though the room had no occupant yet, it symbolized their faith that a child's laughter would echo there one day. But the path wasn't always smooth. One evening, Jonathan came home stressed from work and slipped into old habits, silence avoidance. Grace noticed immediately. Instead of accusing, she sat across from him, opening their shared brown notebook. On a fresh page, she wrote, "Today I felt you pulling away. I'm sad, but I won't stay silent anymore." She handed it to him. Jonathan read, his eyes softening. He took the pen and wrote beneath, "I'm sorry. I'm still scared of failing, but I don't want to hurt you. Thank you for reminding me." Setting the pen down, he looked at Grace with gratitude. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Grace took his hand, replying softly, "Because we promised not to run anymore." The following month, they hosted a small gathering for friends and family at home. The atmosphere buzzed with laughter filling the room. Everyone noticed the change. Jonathan was warmer and more approachable. Grace radiated confidence, and her eyes were full of trust. During a toast, Lisa pulled Grace aside, whispering, "I've never seen you this happy. You made the right choice." Grace squeezed her sister's hand, tears in her eyes as she smiled. One late afternoon, as sunlight poured into the living room, Jonathan placed a contract on the table. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Bringing work home?" He shook his head. "No, it's a charity project. I want to start a fund for families facing domestic violence. After confronting my father, I've thought a lot. I don't want anyone to grow up with the fear I did." Grace paused, then hugged him tightly. "You're turning pain into something good. I'm proud of you." Jonathan whispered, "I wouldn't have had the courage without you." The following spring, joyous news arrived. Grace was pregnant, holding the test with 2 lines. She trembled and cried. When Jonathan heard, he enveloped her in a tight embrace, his eyes misty. "I was afraid I'd be a terrible father," he said. "But now I believe we can do this together." Jonathan cared for Grace so attentively in the following months that she laughed. "You're turning me into a princess." He just shook his head. "You deserve it." As they awaited the baby, they prepared everything from nursery paint colors to tiny clothes. Nightly they talked about names, the future, and their hope that their child would grow up in a home filled with love, free of past shadows. One evening, leaning against Jonathan's shoulder, Grace said softly, "We've come so far. I never thought I'd feel this at peace." Jonathan held her closer. "And I promise from now on, we'll write this story with faith and courage every day." The day their child was born, the sky seemed brighter. Jonathan held Grace's hand in the hospital room, his eyes fixed on her tired but joyful face. When the baby's first cry rang out, he nearly wept. "Hello, little angel," he whispered, trembling as he held their newborn. "Mom and Dad promise always to be here, loving you with everything we have." Grace looked at him, tears falling, but her smile was radiant. In that moment, she knew a marriage once on the brink had been reborn, stronger and more enduring than ever. This was a new beginning, not just for Jonathan and Grace, but for a family writing the first page of their life story.